The dirt beneath her fingernails had become so familiar that Josephine Johnson barely noticed the pain anymore as she clawed at the hard Texas earth, desperate to unearth something, anything, that might feed her through another week. The October sun of 1883 beat down mercilessly on the small patch of land outside Terlingua, and sweat dripped from her brow as she dug with raw, bleeding hands into the rocky soil where wild potatoes grew sparse and stubborn. She had been at it since dawn, her simple cotton dress stained with dust and mud, her dark hair falling loose from its bun. At 22 years old, Josephine had already buried a father to consumption and watched her mother fade away from grief just 6 months later. The small homestead they had claimed 3 years ago now belonged to her alone, along with all its hardships and impossible demands. The garden tools had been sold months ago to pay for medicine that never came in time, and now she made do with what God gave her, her own 2 hands and a will that refused to break. The potato she finally freed from the earth was small and misshapen, barely worth the effort, but she clutched it like gold and set it gently in the weathered basket beside her. 12 potatoes in 4 hours. It was not enough. It would never be enough. But Josephine had learned not to dwell on such thoughts. She pushed her hair back with a dirt-caked hand and returned to digging, her fingers scraping against stones and roots. She did not hear the horse approach until its shadow fell across her work. Josephine looked up sharply, squinting against the sun, her heart hammering the way it always did when strangers came near. A lone woman on the outskirts of town was vulnerable in ways she tried not to think about. The man sat tall in his saddle, his face shaded by a wide-brimmed hat, and for a moment neither of them spoke. Then he dismounted with the easy grace of someone who had spent more years on horseback than on foot, and Josephine could see him clearly. He was perhaps 25 or 26, with sun-bronzed skin and eyes the color of creek water in summer. His jaw was strong and dusted with several days of stubble, and he wore the practical clothes of a working cowboy, chaps over worn denim, a leather vest over a faded blue shirt, and a bandana tied loosely around his neck. "Madam," he said, touching the brim of his hat. His voice was low and careful as though he sensed her wariness. "I do not mean to intrude." Josephine sat back on her heels, acutely aware of how she must look, filthy and desperate and half wild. "Then maybe you should not," she said, but there was no real hostility in her voice, only exhaustion. The cowboy glanced at her hands, then at the basket with its meager collection of potatoes, then at the ground she had been working. Something shifted in his expression, a kind of recognition that made Josephine's chest tighten with shame. "I am Quincy Harper," he said. "I have been working cattle drives between here and New Mexico, but I just signed on with the Ramirez Ranch about 5 miles west. I was heading into town when I saw you from the road." "Good for you," Josephine said flatly. "I am sure Mr. Ramirez is lucky to have you." Quincy did not rise to her bitterness. Instead, he crouched down, his eyes on the hard, packed earth. "This soil is rough, and those potatoes, they grow deep, must be hard work without proper tools." "I manage," Josephine said, but her voice cracked on the words despite herself. Quincy looked at her directly then, and there was no pity in his gaze, only a straightforward kind of understanding that made something in Josephine's chest ease despite her best efforts to stay guarded. "I am heading into town," he said. "Let me buy you some tools. A spade at least, maybe a small pickaxe for the rocks." Josephine's pride flared hot and immediate. "I do not need your charity, Mr. Harper." "It is not charity," Quincy said calmly. "I would offer the same to anyone I saw working themselves to the bone when $1's worth of iron could make the difference. You can pay me back if it matters that much to you, but right now, I am offering to help. Josephine wanted to refuse. Every instinct told her to send him away, to protect herself from obligation and the complicated feelings that came with accepting help from strangers, especially handsome strangers with kind eyes and steady voices. But her hands were bleeding and the basket held barely enough potatoes to last 3 days, and winter was coming whether her pride could bear it or not. "Fine," she said quietly, "but I will pay you back. Every cent." Quincy nodded as though they had just concluded a business transaction and rose to his feet. "I will be back within the hour. Do you need anything else while I am in town?" "No," Josephine said, then hesitated. "Maybe some cornmeal if it is not too much trouble. I can pay you back for that too." "Cornmeal it is," Quincy said. He swung back into his saddle with that same fluid grace, tipped his hat to her once more, and rode toward Terlingua at an easy canter. Josephine watched him go, her heart beating strangely in her chest. She did not trust easy kindness. She had learned the hard way that nothing came without strings, without expectations. But something about the quiet certainty in Quincy Harper's manner made her want to believe that maybe, just this once, someone might help simply because it was the right thing to do. She returned to digging, but her mind was elsewhere now, turning over the brief encounter like a puzzle she could not quite solve. By the time Quincy returned, the sun had climbed higher, and Josephine had managed to extract 3 more potatoes from the stubborn earth. He came bearing a sturdy spade, a small pickaxe with a worn but serviceable handle, and a cloth sack that smelled of cornmeal and something else, something sweet. Josephine stood as he approached on foot, leading his horse by the reins. "That was fast," she said, eyeing the tools. "Mr. Patterson at the general store is efficient when he wants to be," Quincy said. He held out the spade. "I figured we could start with the area you have been working and see how deep these potatoes really go." Josephine took the spade, her fingers closing around the smooth wooden handle. It felt foreign after months of using only her hands. "Oui," she asked. "If you do not mind the company," Quincy said. "I told the Ramirez Ranch I would start tomorrow. Today I have got nothing but time." Josephine should have said no. She should have thanked him and sent him on his way, maintained the distance that kept her safe. But the thought of digging alone for another 6 hours made her bones ache, and there was something about Quincy's presence that felt solid and real in a way that nothing had for a long time. "I do not mind," she said softly. They worked side by side as the sun climbed toward noon. Quincy used the pickaxe to break up the rockiest sections while Josephine followed with the spade, and the difference was remarkable. Potatoes that would have taken her an hour to reach with her bare hands came free in minutes. They fell into an easy rhythm, not talking much at first, just the sound of metal on stone and the occasional grunt of effort. "How long have you been out here alone?" Quincy asked after a while, pausing to wipe sweat from his forehead. 6 months since my mother passed," Josephine said, driving the spade into the earth with more force than necessary. 3 years before that with both my parents. That is a long time to work a homestead without help." "I do what I have to do," Josephine said. She unearthed a particularly large potato and felt a surge of satisfaction. "My father claimed this land thinking it would be our fortune. Turns out West Texas does not give up its riches easily." "No," Quincy agreed. "It does not. But it builds strong people in the trying." Josephine glanced at him. "You sound like you have done your share of trying." Quincy smiled, and it transformed his face from merely handsome to something that made Josephine's stomach flip. "My father worked himself to death trying to make a go of a ranch in New Mexico territory. My mother went back east to live with family after he died. I have been on my own since I was 18. That was 8 years ago. Cattle drives, ranch work, whatever keeps me fed and moving." "Why moving?" Josephine asked. Quincy's smile faded into something more contemplative. "I suppose I have been looking for something. I just never knew what until recently." "And what changed recently?" He met her eyes, and the directness of his gaze made her breath catch. "I realized I was tired of drifting. Started thinking maybe it was time to put down roots somewhere, build something that lasts." They worked in silence after that, but it was a different kind of silence, charged with unspoken things. By the time the sun began its descent toward the horizon, they had filled 3 baskets with potatoes, more than Josephine had managed in the entire week before. "I should let you rest," Quincy said as they surveyed their work. "You have been at this since dawn." "Thank you," Josephine said, and she meant it with every fiber of her being. "For the tools, for the help, for everything. I will pay you back, I promise." "Come to the Ramirez ranch when you can," Quincy said, "but there is no rush. I know you are good for it." He hesitated, then added, "Would it be all right if I came by again? Maybe in a few days, see how you are managing." Josephine knew she should say no. Knew she should protect herself from the hope that was already taking root in her chest, fragile and terrifying. But she heard herself say, "I would like that," and meant it. Quincy's smile returned, warm and genuine. "Then I will see you soon, Miss Johnson." "Josephine," she said. "You can call me Josephine." "Josephine," he repeated, as though testing how the name felt on his tongue. "I will see you soon, Josephine." He rode away as the sky turned gold and pink, and Josephine stood in her potato patch surrounded by the fruits of their labor, her heart beating fast and strange in her chest. She told herself it was just gratitude, just relief at having help when she needed it most. But when she lay in bed that night, her hands finally clean and bandaged, it was Quincy's smile she saw behind her closed eyes, and the memory of his voice saying her name that carried her into sleep. 3 days passed before Quincy returned, and Josephine spent every one of them pretending she was not watching the road. She worked her potato patch with the tools he had bought, marveling at how much easier everything was with proper equipment. She made cornbread with the meal he had brought, rationing it carefully. And she tried not to think about the way her heart had jumped when he smiled at her, or the warmth of his presence beside her as they worked. When he finally appeared on the 4th day, riding up in the late afternoon with the sun at his back, Josephine felt something in her chest unfold like a flower opening to light. "Josephine," he called out as he dismounted, "how has the work been going?" "Better," she said, trying to keep her voice steady. "Much better. The tools make all the difference." Quincy surveyed the expanded potato patch, the neat rows she had managed to clear and work. "You have been busy. This is impressive." "I am motivated," Josephine said dryly. "Hunger is a powerful teacher," Quincy's expression sobered. "Have you been eating enough? I should have brought more cornmeal." "I am managing," Josephine said, but even as she spoke, her stomach betrayed her with a low growl. She felt heat rise to her cheeks. Without a word, Quincy went to his saddlebag and pulled out a cloth-wrapped bundle. "I brought some things from the ranch. Mr. Ramirez pays in meals as well as money, and the cook is generous. There is bread here, some dried beef, and apples from the tree in the yard." Josephine wanted to refuse, wanted to maintain the independence she had fought so hard to preserve. But the smell of fresh bread made her mouth water, and she was so tired of being hungry, so tired of pretending she did not need help. "Thank you," she whispered, taking the bundle. "I do not know how to repay all this kindness." "You do not have to repay kindness," Quincy said gently. "That is what makes it kindness." They sat in the shade of the small cottonwood tree near her cabin, sharing the food Quincy had brought. Josephine had not realized how lonely she had been until she had someone to talk to. Someone who listened when she spoke about her parents and the homestead, and her dreams of making something of this hard land. "My father used to say that Texas rewards the stubborn," she said, biting into an apple that tasted like heaven. "I used to think he was a fool for believing it. Now I think maybe he was right, just not in the way he expected." "How do you mean?" Quincy asked. "He thought the land would give us wealth," Josephine said. "Gold or silver or rich soil that grew anything we planted. But the real reward is not wealth. It is strength. It is learning what you are made of when everything tries to break you." Quincy nodded slowly. "I have thought something similar. Every time I wanted to give up on a cattle drive, every time I thought about heading back east where life is easier, something kept me here. I think it was knowing that if I could make it in the West, I could make it anywhere." "And can you?" Josephine asked. "Make it, I mean. I am still here," Quincy said, and his smile was soft and a little sad. "I suppose that counts for something." They talked until the sun set and the stars came out, bright and endless in the clear Texas sky. Josephine could not remember the last time she had felt so at ease with another person, so seen and understood. When Quincy finally rose to leave, she felt the loss of his presence like a physical ache. "I will come back soon," he promised, "if that is all right with you." "It is more than all right," Josephine said, and the honesty in her voice surprised her. Quincy reached out and gently took her hand, his thumb brushing over the healing cuts on her fingers. "You have worked so hard," he said quietly. "You deserve to have someone share the burden." Josephine's throat tightened with emotion. "I have gotten used to doing everything alone." "Maybe it is time to get unused to it," Quincy said, and then he was gone, riding into the darkness with a final wave. The days fell into a pattern after that. Quincy came whenever he could spare time from the Ramirez ranch, sometimes in the evenings after a long day of work, sometimes on Sunday afternoons when the ranch was quiet. They worked the potato patch together, expanding it and improving the soil. They fixed the fence around Josephine's property. They repaired the roof of her small cabin where it had started to leak. And they talked. They talked about everything and nothing, about their pasts and their hopes, and the little observations that made life interesting. Josephine learned that Quincy had a gift with horses, that he could calm even the most temperamental stallion with patience and a gentle hand. She learned that he had a younger sister back east whom he missed terribly, but rarely saw. She learned that he loved the sound of rain on a tin roof, and hated the taste of whiskey, and believed that an honest day's work was worth more than any amount of gold. Quincy learned that Josephine could shoot better than most men, that her father had taught her to handle a rifle when she was 12. He learned that she had a beautiful singing voice that she only used when she thought no one was listening. He learned that she was fiercely proud and tender-hearted in equal measure, that she cried over injured animals but faced down rattlesnakes without flinching. As October gave way to November, something shifted between them. The casual touches lingered longer. The silences grew comfortable and charged with meaning. Josephine found herself thinking about Quincy constantly, wondering what he was doing, whether he was thinking of her. She caught him watching her sometimes with an expression that made her heart race, something warm and longing and almost reverent. It all came to a head on a cool November evening when they were working together to harvest the last of the potatoes before the first frost. The basket was nearly full, and Josephine was laughing at something Quincy had said when she lost her footing on the uneven ground. She would have fallen hard if Quincy had not caught her, his arms wrapping around her waist and pulling her against his chest. For a moment they stood frozen, Josephine's hands braced against his shoulders, Quincy's arms secure around her. She could feel the steady beat of his heart, could see the way his eyes darkened as he looked down at her. "Josephine," he said, and his voice was rough with emotion. I need to tell you something." "What is it?" she whispered, hardly daring to breathe. "I think I am falling in love with you," Quincy said. "No, that is not right. I know I am falling in love with you. I have been falling since the first day I saw you digging in this field with your bare hands, so determined and strong and beautiful. I know it is fast. I know we have only known each other a few weeks, but I cannot keep pretending I do not feel this way." Josephine's eyes filled with tears. "Quincy, you do not have to say anything," he said quickly. "I just needed you to know. I needed you to understand that I am not helping you out of pity or obligation. I am helping you because I care about you, because seeing you struggle tears me apart, because I want to be part of your life in whatever way you will let me." "You fool," Josephine said, and she was crying and laughing at the same time. "You wonderful, impossible fool. I am falling in love with you too. I have been fighting it because I was scared, because I did not want to need anyone again after losing everyone I have ever needed. But I cannot fight it anymore. I do not want to fight it anymore." Quincy made a sound that was half laugh, half sob, and then he was kissing her, his lips warm and gentle against hers. Josephine melted into him, her hands sliding up to tangle in his hair, and for the first time in longer than she could remember, she felt safe. Not just physically safe, but emotionally safe, as though she had finally found a place where she could rest without fear of it being taken away. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Quincy rested his forehead against hers. "I want to marry you," he said. "I want to wake up beside you every morning and work this land with you and build a life that is ours together. But I will wait as long as you need. I will court you properly and—" "Yes," Josephine interrupted. Quincy blinked. "Yes. Yes, I will marry you," Josephine said, fresh tears streaming down her face. "I do not need a long courtship. I do not need flowers and poetry. I need you, Quincy Harper. I need your strength and your kindness and the way you look at me like I am the most precious thing in the world. So yes, I will marry you." Quincy kissed her again, deeper this time, with all the pent-up longing of the past weeks pouring out between them. When they finally pulled apart, he was grinning like a man who had just struck gold. "We should go into town tomorrow," he said. "Talk to the preacher, make it official. I do not want to wait any longer than we have to." "Tomorrow," Josephine agreed, and she kissed him again just because she could, just because he was hers and she was his, and the future suddenly looked bright with possibility. They were married 3 days later in the small church in Terlingua, with the preacher's wife and Mr. Patterson from the general store as witnesses. Josephine wore her mother's best dress, carefully preserved in the trunk at the foot of her bed, and Quincy wore a new shirt he had bought specially for the occasion. The ceremony was simple and quick, but when Quincy slipped a plain gold band onto her finger and promised to love her until death parted them, Josephine felt the weight of those words settle into her bones like an anchor, solid and true. They spent their wedding night in Josephine's small cabin, and if the bed was narrow and the walls were thin, neither of them cared. Quincy was gentle and patient, treating Josephine with a reverence that made her weep with the beauty of it. They came together with all the passion and tenderness that had been building between them, and afterward, lying tangled in each other's arms, Josephine thought that she had never been happier. "I love you," she whispered against Quincy's chest, listening to the steady rhythm of his heartbeat. "I love you too," Quincy murmured, pressing a kiss to the top of her head. "My wife. My beautiful, stubborn, strong wife." Josephine smiled in the darkness. "What are we going to do now?" "Now," Quincy said, "we build a life. I have been saving my wages, and with both of us working, we can expand the homestead. Plant more crops in the spring, maybe get some chickens, eventually a cow or two. It will be hard work, but I think we can make something good here." "Something good," Josephine repeated, liking the sound of it. I like that. The winter that followed was hard, as winters in West Texas always were, but Josephine and Quincy faced it together. Quincy continued working at the Ramirez Ranch, bringing home wages that allowed them to buy supplies and improve the homestead. Josephine tended the property, preserving the potato harvest and preparing for spring planting. In the evenings, they would sit by the fire, Quincy mending tack or carving wood while Josephine sewed or read aloud from the few books they owned. There were hard days, days when the wind cut through the cabin walls and the work seemed endless and the future uncertain. But there were more good days, days filled with laughter and love, and the simple satisfaction of building something together. Quincy proved to be everything Josephine had hoped and more, a partner in the truest sense of the word. He never made her feel less than his equal, never dismissed her ideas, or treated her contributions as anything less than essential. In return, Josephine opened her heart in ways she had thought impossible after her parents' deaths. She let Quincy see her fears and her weaknesses, her moments of doubt and despair, and he held her through all of it, steady and sure, never wavering in his love or his commitment. Spring came with its promise of renewal, and they planted a proper garden together, not just potatoes but beans and corn and squash. Quincy built a chicken coop with lumber he bought with his savings, and they purchased 6 hens that would provide eggs and eventually meat. The homestead began to look less like a dying dream and more like a living, thriving reality. One evening in late April, as they sat on the porch watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of orange and pink, Josephine turned to Quincy with a shy smile. "I have something to tell you," she said, reaching for his hand. Quincy laced his fingers through hers, his expression curious. "What is it?" "I am with child," Josephine said softly. "I have been sure for a few weeks now, but I wanted to wait until I was certain before I told you." For a moment, Quincy just stared at her, his mouth slightly open. Then his face broke into the widest smile she had ever seen, and he pulled her into his arms, laughing and crying at the same time. "A baby," he said, his voice choked with emotion. "We are going to have a baby. Are you happy?" Josephine asked, though she could see the answer written all over his face. "Happy does not begin to cover it," Quincy said. He cupped her face in his hands and kissed her deeply. "You have given me everything, Josephine. A home, a purpose, a future, and now a family. I did not know it was possible to love someone as much as I love you." Josephine felt tears slide down her cheeks. "I love you too, so much that sometimes it scares me. But then I remember that you are here, that you are real, that this is our life, and the fear goes away." They spent the evening making plans, talking about the baby and the future and all the things they would teach their child. Quincy became even more protective of Josephine, insisting she rest more and let him handle the heavier work around the homestead. Josephine protested at first, unused to being coddled, but eventually she gave in, touched by the depth of his concern. The months passed in a blur of preparation and anticipation. They expanded the cabin, adding a small room for the baby with a cradle that Quincy built himself. Josephine sewed tiny clothes and blankets, her heart swelling with love for the child she had not yet met. The garden flourished under their care, and the chickens laid eggs reliably, and slowly but surely the homestead became profitable. In late November, as the first anniversary of their meeting approached, Josephine went into labor. It was a long and difficult birth, with only Quincy and the midwife from town to help her through it. But when she finally held her son in her arms, red-faced and squalling and absolutely perfect, Josephine thought her heart might burst with joy. "He is beautiful," Quincy whispered, staring down at the baby with wonder in his eyes. "He looks just like you." "He has your chin," Josephine said, running a finger gently over the baby's soft cheek. What should we name him? They had discussed names for months, going back and forth on possibilities. But looking at their son, so small and new and full of potential, only one name felt right. Samuel, Quincy said, after your father, so that he knows where he comes from and what it took to build this life for him. Josephine's eyes filled with tears. Samuel Harper, I love it. Samuel proved to be a healthy, happy baby who rarely fussed and slept well from the start. Quincy was a devoted father, taking on extra work so that Josephine could focus on caring for their son. He would come home exhausted from long days at the ranch, but his face would light up the moment he saw Samuel, and he would spend hours just holding the baby, talking to him in a soft, gentle voice that made Josephine fall in love with him all over again. The years that followed were not without their challenges. There were droughts that tested their crops and harsh winters that strained their resources. There were illnesses and accidents and moments of doubt when the weight of responsibility felt crushing. But through it all, Josephine and Quincy faced everything as they had from the beginning together, with love and determination and an unshakable faith in each other. When Samuel was 3, they welcomed a daughter they named Clara, after Quincy's mother. She had Josephine's dark hair and Quincy's green eyes, and she was as spirited and stubborn as both her parents combined. 2 years after that came another son, Thomas, who was quiet and thoughtful and loved animals with a passion that reminded Josephine of her own father. The homestead grew along with their family. Quincy eventually left the Ramirez Ranch to work their own land full-time, and together they expanded their operations to include cattle and horses. They built a proper house to replace the small cabin, with enough rooms for their growing family and a big kitchen where Josephine could cook, and the children could do their lessons. They became respected members of the Terlingua community, known for their hard work and their generosity. When neighbors needed help, Quincy was always the first to volunteer, remembering how lost Josephine had been when he first found her digging potatoes with her bare hands. Josephine organized community events and helped other women new to the area, paying forward the kindness that had been shown to her. On their 10th wedding anniversary, Quincy surprised Josephine with a trip to town. He had arranged for a neighbor to watch the children, and they spent the day just the two of them, shopping and eating at the small restaurant and talking without interruption. As they sat on a bench outside the general store, watching the sun set over the Texas landscape, Quincy took Josephine's hand. "You remember the day we met?" he asked. Josephine laughed. "How could I forget? I was filthy and desperate and probably not very welcoming." "You were the most beautiful thing I had ever seen," Quincy said seriously. "I rode up to this woman digging in the dirt with her bare hands, so determined and strong, and I thought, this is someone worth knowing. This is someone worth fighting for." "I thought you were going to be trouble," Josephine admitted. "Too handsome and too kind, and I did not trust either of those things." "And now," Quincy asked with a smile. "Now I trust you more than anyone in the world," Josephine said. She leaned her head on his shoulder, feeling perfectly content. "You saved me, you know. Not just from hunger or hardship, but from loneliness, from the belief that I had to do everything alone. You taught me that accepting help is not weakness, that love is not a burden but a gift." "You saved me too," Quincy said, pressing a kiss to her temple. "I was drifting before I met you, looking for something I could not name, and then I saw you in that field, and suddenly I knew exactly what I had been searching for. A home, a purpose. Someone to love and build a life with." They sat in comfortable silence, watching the sky turn from gold to purple to deep blue. After a while, Quincy spoke again. "I bought you something," he said, pulling a small package from his pocket. Josephine took it with curious hands and unwrapped it carefully. Inside was a pair of delicate leather gloves, soft and beautifully made. "So you never have to dig with your bare hands again," Quincy said softly. Josephine looked at the gloves, then at her husband, and felt tears slip down her cheeks. "They are perfect," she whispered. "You are perfect." "Not perfect," Quincy said, wiping away her tears with gentle fingers. "Just lucky enough to have found you." They returned home that night to find their children asleep and the house peaceful. They made love slowly and tenderly, with all the passion and familiarity of a decade together. And afterward, lying in each other's arms, Josephine thought about how far they had come from that first day in the potato patch. The years continued to pass, bringing both joys and sorrows. They lost Quincy's mother to age and never got to reconcile in person, though Quincy wrote her letters every month until the end. They weathered economic downturns and personal setbacks, but through it all, their love remained constant, a foundation upon which everything else was built. Samuel grew into a fine young man who shared his father's way with horses and his mother's determination. He eventually started his own ranch just outside Terlingua, close enough to visit regularly, but far enough to build his own legacy. Clara became a teacher, bringing education to the children of West Texas with a passion that made her parents proud. Thomas took over the family homestead when Quincy and Josephine grew older, working the land with the same love and care that had been poured into it for decades. On their 30th wedding anniversary, their children and grandchildren gathered at the homestead for a celebration. The house was filled with noise and laughter and love, and as Josephine looked around at the family they had created, she felt overwhelmed with gratitude. That evening, after everyone had gone home and the house was quiet again, Josephine and Quincy walked out to the old potato patch. It was long since abandoned as a working field, now just a grassy area near the barn, but it held a special significance for both of them. "I come out here sometimes," Quincy admitted, taking Josephine's hand, "when I need to remember where we started." "Me too," Josephine said. She could still picture it so clearly, herself on her knees in the dirt, exhausted and alone, and then Quincy appearing like an answer to a prayer she had not known how to voice. "You ever regret it?" Quincy asked. "Choosing this life, choosing me?" Josephine turned to face him, cupping his weathered face in her hands. He was 56 now, his hair more gray than brown, his face lined with decades of sun and hard work. But his eyes were still that same clear green, and when he looked at her, she still saw the same love that had been there from the beginning. "Not for a single moment," she said firmly. "You are the best thing that ever happened to me, Quincy Harper. You and our children and this life we built together. I would choose it all again in a heartbeat." Quincy pulled her close, holding her with the same gentle strength that had comforted her through 30 years of marriage. "I love you, Josephine. From that first day until my last breath, I will love you." "And I love you," Josephine whispered against his chest, "always and forever." They stood there in the gathering darkness, two people who had found each other against all odds and built something beautiful out of hard Texas dirt and stubborn determination, and a love that refused to quit. The wind whispered through the grass where potatoes had once grown, where a desperate woman had dug with bleeding hands, and a lonely cowboy had stopped to offer help. It was a simple beginning, but it had led to an extraordinary life. And as Josephine and Quincy walked back to their house hand in hand, surrounded by the land they had nurtured and the legacy they had built, they knew without question that every struggle had been worth it. The homestead continued to thrive under Thomas's care, passed down through generations of Harpers who knew the story of how it all began. The tale of the woman digging potatoes with her bare hands and the cowboy who bought her tools and helped her dig became family legend, told and retold to children and grandchildren, a reminder that love often comes when we least expect it, that kindness matters, that the hardest soil can yield the richest harvest if tended with care and patience. Josephine and Quincy lived to see their golden anniversary, surrounded by children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren, a family tree that spread wide and strong from the roots they had planted together. And when they finally passed, within months of each other, as often happens with couples who have loved deeply and long, they were laid to rest on a hill overlooking the homestead, beneath a simple stone that bore their names and a single line. Together, they built a life worth living. The old potato patch remained, a patch of unremarkable ground that held the memory of a beginning. And sometimes, when the wind was right and the light fell just so, you could almost see them there, a young woman with dirt under her nails and determination in her eyes, and a young cowboy with kind hands and a generous heart, digging side by side in the Texas earth, building the foundation of a love that would last forever.